Hello, welcome to MzansiOz Diary. My name is Connie. If you're new here, you're very much welcome. So today's video is going to be about the Expropriation Act that was signed into a law. It was an amendment of the South African Expropriation Act of 1975. Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, signed this, and so that was the bill. Now it's a law because it's an act. That bill had gone through both the upper house and the lower house, and now it was awaiting for him to sign. Once the bill is signed under the South African law, the president signed the bill, becomes an act, so it becomes the law of the land. I'm going to play a clip from Australia. That clip is from the Sky News. They're discussing this, and I'll give you guys my response and thoughts about what they said. Let's listen.
Let's head overseas now, where South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has a new law allowing land seizures by the state without compensation if the government determines it is quote-unquote just and equitable and in the public interest to do so. Now, the reasons for nil compensation vary from abandonment or disuse to health and safety concerns or quote-unquote public interest, which could be basically anything the government of the day thought was good. They've been pushing for this for 5 years. They've had lengthy public consultation processes, and it repeals the Expropriation Act of 1975, which, much like compulsory acquisition here, said you had to be compensated if the government took your land. Now, some members of the South African government are saying they're going to challenge the legality of all of this, Evelyn, but the idea that the government could come in for any reason it deems to be in the public interest and take your land away for zilch is insane.
Oh, it is, but this is the future. Like, I know this is like from one extreme to another, but like, think about what we're doing in our country with the Indigenous. Like, we continually are giving back land under the guise of, you know, we're the oppressors and we took this, we colonised. But this is exactly how it started in South Africa. And so, like, I think we've got to be really careful and see this as heed this as a warning. I mean, look at Zimbabwe. This happened in Zimbabwe. This is going to be Zimbabwe 2.0. There's going to be food shortages. There's going to be all kinds of poverty. And then they're going to be asking for the people that they kicked out of their country to come back and help them, essentially. It's really sad. I have some friends in South Africa. I've interviewed some farmers over there who are massively being genocided over. Like, there's no other word for it. And it's really scary because some of these farms have been in families for 400 and something years. It's not like they've walked in there in the last, 50 odd modern years. Like, these have been generational farms, and now the government can essentially come in and say, you know what, because you're a white farmer in South Africa, we're going to take this land back because it's not benefiting our country to have you here anymore.
And that'll be the public interest argument,
Exactly.
where the apartheid, which was awful, and then the pendulum seems to have gone
That's
completely
right.
So this clip really highlighted the extent to which the media in Australia are very much divisive. They create division within the communities by the things they post, things they say, that they have not done a thorough, diligent homework. What she just said there, and things, it is so much, there's a lot to unpack there. And I'm going to start by saying that the Expropriation Act of 1975 had the power to expropriate land. And that was also similar to the current amendment, which is the general purpose use or public interest. The stark difference, however, is that the Expropriation Act of 1975 was based on apartheid law. What was a general interest, public interest, had to align with the apartheid segregation laws. That's number one. The current amendment, it's aligned with the current South African constitution that is been reviewed across the globe as inclusive, that's very adaptable to the culture and protects everyone, including the LGBTQ plus. Remember, South Africa was the fourth country to legalize gay marriages and recognize people's choices. It's because of the Constitution of South Africa that was enacted since 1995 at the dawn of the current South African democracy. Okay, so the Expropriation Act of 1975 had forced removals. So it was aligned with the apartheid laws. So it had forced removals of black South Africans from their land into areas that they called Bantustan Group Area Act. Does this Australian Expropriation Act has similar clause, forced removal? What is she saying? Is she saying that current Australian law is similar to apartheid law of South Africa, which was designed to marginalize and remove black South Africans from their own land, not the one they stolen, the land they owned, that they lived there for decades before the colonial. So what is she talking about here? She is actually uttering this neo-Nazi Elon Musk propaganda that's been perpetrated by Donald Trump and Elon Musk against the South African government. That's what she is pandering here towards on this issue that she knows nothing about. Zero. It fell short below the standard of what journalism should be all about. She has not done any of her homework. This is propaganda. This is why us Australians rejected the MAD bill, misinformation and disinformation that was going to make people like her to be actually excluded from scrutiny of the things that they say. Because that is like, gosh, what is the piece, what she got this information from the neo-Nazi saluting people. Maybe that's why she's getting that from, which I think is what she's pandering to. I saw a lot of these clips, but she hasn't done her homework. That is not what journalists should be all about. Okay, you shouldn't be going on national news and spewing divisions among the community. There's a huge South African Australian community here. So that, for me, listening to that was crap. You know, it was like, oh my God, you failed to actually acknowledge the issue here at play. And, you know, I think South Africans are very mature enough to deal with the issues themselves without having international interference, because we don't like people interfering in our affairs. So I think DA learned about that in the last election. So another thing about this Expropriation Act of 1975, it had legal constraints. People who were dispossessed could not go to court. In the current amendment, people can go to court if they're not happy about the circumstances about the land being expropriated by the government for public interest or general use purposes. Okay. So the really impact of this Expropriation Act of 1975, it had huge impact in South Africa. It continued to have huge impact. It reinforced the apartheid practice policies and practices. It also, what it did, it also had economic dispossession, because as you can see now, black South African have been, the neighborhood are far away from the city center. I gave you a story a while ago about those kids who died from organophosphate poisoning, and how long the ambulance took for the ambulance to get to them. That was one of those. Not only economic dispossession, which we know that economic dispossession there's a huge correlation between the economic dispossession and also with the the health consequences, the access to healthcare. So that is one of the issues here about the impact of this Expropriation Act of 1975. There are certain things that it still continue today is the legacy of land inequity in South Africa, which continue today. I mean, in 2017, they did a survey and found that most of the land in South Africa is still concentrated around the 72 white minority in South Africa. And those land, most of them are abandoned land. They're not being used. So there is an issue here of the government being able to expropriate that land and provide it to people who need the land. It is part of the government to do that, to be able to settle people in places that provide them with dignity, so you don't have a lot of mikuku, aka tent cities, popping up like deadly mushroom everywhere. So that is the reason why this amendment is needed. But having said that, this law itself has a lot of problem on itself. And one of the things that the law has problem about is the complexity of administrative burden. That in a way that, the advocate Mbege is going to talk about this case because he is the expert here, is a law expert, and we saw him in action. Let's have a look at him in action in ICJ.
President and distinguished members of the court, it is a privilege to appear before the court on behalf of South Africa. I will address Israel's genocidal intent. At this stage, the court is not required to determine that the only inference to be drawn from the available evidence is genocidal to order provisional measures, as that is to decide the merits. Rather, the assessment of the existence of an intent to destroy could be made by the court only at the stage of the examination of the merits. That some of the alleged acts may also amount to atrocities other than genocide does not exclude the finding of plausible acts of genocide. Madam President, South Africa is not alone in drawing attention to Israel's genocidal rhetoric.
So he's going to give us some breakdown about this law, not these two people who are uneducated, know nothing about South Africa, politics, and actually the issues around South Africa that at play now and today. All right, so before we go to that clip with Advocate Temega, there's also another thing that I want to talk about that's quite important here that she mentioned, that is that pandering towards that neo-Nazi white nationalists in South Africa around the farm. Okay, she's talking about white farmers. I don't know whether she's decided to talk about white farmers as a invoke the racial issue that she inherently has in her, or she assumed that being a farmer in South Africa means you must be white. The two things that she trying to communicate to Australian audiences that, or international audiences, that white in South Africa, who are farmers in South Africa, are always white. Therefore, any crime committed towards farmers in South Africa, it's white farmers. That on itself, it shows a little bit more about her white supremacy, her ideology, because white farming in South Africa, farmers in general, they're all racist in South Africa. There is Indian farmers, there's black farmers, there's Asian farmers, Chinese farmers who are South African citizens, who are farmers. So it's not just white farmers that she's trying to pander towards. So like I said, she's pandering to that white neo-Nazi liberal Afroforum type ideology that continue to perpetrate this narrative internationally that crime committed in South Africa by people that are mainly being harbored by farmers who do not want to pay the minimum wage standard to South Africans because they invite these illegals, then they try to turn on them because of the condition they subject them into. We had a story last year about a farmer in South Africa that actually murdered his illegal immigrants, and then feed them to pigs. One of them was South African, and the another one, two of them were immigrants, illegal immigrants. He fed them to pigs. So she wants to come here to the Australian audience and pander to this divisive white nationalist ideology in Sky News about the crime that is so perverse in South African society, and it's mainly concentrated towards the black community, and assumed that because the farmers do experience crime, so maybe according to her ideology, you shouldn't have crime experienced by white people. Crime should be experienced by black people in a country where there is a lot of crime. That's what probably she's trying to communicate to us, that crime, white people should not experience crime, because what she's talking about here is she's trying to paint it as genocide, which is the crime. I don't know whether she's looked at what genocide means. The word genocide can't just throw it around and allege some genocide because it's not appropriate to do that. But she's pandering to that ideology. She's pandering to the narrative that we must try and find fault towards South African government because they have alleged that Israel had a genocidal intent towards Palestinian people. So therefore, we must try to every crime committed towards any group, whether it's illegal migrants who committed crimes for themselves to enter South Africa and they find themselves stuck somewhere in the hole, we should say it's genocide. We should paint it as genocide. I mean, people are smart enough to know the difference between genocidal intent and criminality. Yes, South Africa has a high number of crimes, and most of these crimes are committed in the black community, in this Bantustan community, due to mainly the inequality and the social circumstance that exists since the end of apartheid. She also mentioned about the food insecurity that farmers will live and stuff. As we speak at the moment, the economy of South Africa is not doing well. The unemployment is around 60%. If it will rise, and if it rises, it doesn't mean because of this piece of legislation that's been amended a few days ago. Okay, for the first time in South Africa, they've actually imported maize, which is never occurred before. So that is not to do with a legislation that was not even put in place, that has not been enacted to have food insecurity. Food insecurity continues in South Africa because of this land that is concentrated amongst few people who are not utilizing this land for purpose that was intended. The land is there for market speculation, and the government cannot provide services to the South African community. So it is just inequitable to find a way to expropriate that land, because the compensation the people are going to be compensated. And this next clip we're going to look at Advocate Tembeka, who's going to talk about it. They're going to be compensated, but how they're going to be compensated is totally different than the apartheid compensation that was, if you're black, you don't get zero compensation. And we already have an example in South Africa of the manner in which apartheid government dealt with land for dispossessed South Africans, and that is the Kruger National Park. Kruger National Park belongs to a certain group in South Africa that there's a lot of dispute around that land in Kruger National Park, and that highlighted the very nature of that Expropriation Act of 1975 in South Africa. So let's listen to Advocate Tembega.
General point that every time land is transferred to the hands of black people, it will not be productively used. There are so many instances of land being given to emerging black farmers who are doing excellently, who are involved in the export market, who are involved in resolving the crisis of food shortages in this country. So one cannot make a generic point. There is a different problem, right? There's a different problem, which is the inability of the state to provide what we call post-settlement support, right? Now, that problem must be resolved, but it must not be used as an excuse not to do land reform.
Let's talk about expropriation, which makes provision for what you touched on earlier, for what previously was land or expropriation of land without compensation.
Yeah.
It's a point that many people are worried about. Firstly, is this aligned with the country's supreme law, the Constitution?
Yes, it's clearly aligned. What the Constitution provides in Section 25. In fact, a lot of the time people misread Section 25. They regard it as a property clause. It's actually an anti-property clause. The Constitution, Section 25, creates the power to expropriate, right? So that much is clear. But secondly, it also creates the conditions for the expropriation. On the conditions, we've already touched upon public interest and public purpose, so those concepts are now clear. But it makes it subject to compensation. Now, here is where the debate is. So those who insist that there must be money always paid, they focus too much on that clause, subject to compensation. But what they don't do, they don't look at the words that come thereafter, which is what kind of compensation are we dealing with? And that compensation is just and equitable. So which means what is actually the controlling portion in that section is what does justice and equity require in a specific instance. So I usually make these two examples. Take a white man who has received land as a consequence of inheritance, but we can trace from the arrival of Jan van Riebeeck that this land was acquired improperly by violence, conquest, theft, everything that is associated with colonialism. But they're not using the land, they're living in Germany. But around that area is a large community that is plainly landless and is in need of housing. In those instances, the bill would enable the state to acquire that land subject to nil compensation because it's not productively used, right? Or it has been abandoned. Someone is just not caring for it at all. Or take a different example where I would say market value is justified. Take the community of Tolobin. What has happened is the Australians have discovered titanium in that area, right? So they want to mine it, but they can't mine because there's a community living there. But it is a black community that is the subject of historical dispossession. The question is, do you pay them anything? And how do you calculate? So I would say if you want to remove them in order to make way for a mining activity, then you should pay them. Justice and equity would demand that you pay them market value. So that's why it's absolutely important not to have a one-size-fits-all when it comes to compensation, but to have a scale that would ask the question, what does justice and equity require? So what the bill enables, what the Act, you've corrected me there, what the Act enables the judges to do is that they should take my Tolobin example and pay market-based compensation, and then they should take my German property owner example and pay nil compensation because that is what is required by justice and equity. So it's perfectly compatible with the Constitution, at least on that score.
You've actually explained the three examples that are used in this Act.
Yes.
If it is abandoned,
Yes.
acquired unlawfully, or where market value is negligible
Yes.
compared to public benefits.
Yes.
So the EFF, for example, has said Section 25 needs amending in order to effect the question of land reform. Based on what you've explained, does Section 25 need amending?
No, it has never needed an amendment. In fact, Section 25 was one of the most contentious sections when the Constitution was debated. And there were three areas of contention. One was, should the state have the power to expropriate, right? Which the National Party and the Democratic Party opposed and they lost. The second area of contention was, should there be the right of return, right? Where you have lost your property rights, should you be entitled to return? Many constitutions across the world do not have the right of return.
Yeah.
Right? But we inscribed it, it's in the law. Right? You are entitled to return to where your forefathers were, if you could show that you were dispossessed after 1913. 1913 is a contentious area, but there's a right of return. And then the third one was, in the case of expropriation, what should be the benchmark for the payment? Some constitutions in the world inscribe market value, others do not. We went with those constitutions that do not. And again, even that was contentious. So when Section 25 was therefore adopted, what happened really is that it became the instrument for land reform. That was the purpose behind Section 25. What has happened is that over time, it's been restrictively and conservatively interpreted.
Yeah.
But in itself, the goal of Section 25 is to transform property relations.
I've got less than 4 minutes left. He had so many questions. So with this then, when we conclude on this point, I invoke a political party, the EFF. Let me invoke another one, the Freedom Front Plus, which says it intends going to the Constitutional Court for this new Expropriation Act to be tested there. Do they have a point? Does the Constitutional Court need to test this to see whether or not it is constitutionally sound?
Yeah, look, there are problems with the Act that need clarification. There are concepts that are not clear. There are concepts that at face value appear to stand in conflict with each other. But the biggest problem I find with the Act is how procedural it is. It is a highly complex, highly procedural piece of legislation that actually makes it very, very difficult for the state to do its job. I think the design of this Act is so bad that it's going to take a long, long time before the state can do its land to acquire land for even for public purposes. Do they have we have to see what the complaint is. I saw that one complaint was that there was not enough number of provinces that supported it, but that depends on what the evidence is. But I think that most people would say what they're objecting to is the nil compensation part. Now, on that score, I honestly think they will fail.
Very clear there. Final question, practical solutions for land reform. How can we achieve this proper system of land redistribution that is not going to compromise the productive use of land?
Yeah, I always have a problem when there is a qualification that will not compromise the productive use of land, because the assumption is that as soon as you do land reform, you are going to undermine the productive use of land. Whereas we actually have a crisis now, we don't have a productive use of land despite the market-driven system that we've adopted. So what do we need right now? Firstly, we've got land claims. There are 5,800 claims. They need to be resolved. And when I looked at the plan by the government, it looks like we have another 10 years to resolve these claims. We don't have the 10 years. We have to resolve them now. Second thing is the ANC must do what it promised to do. It needs to pass the land redistribution bill. It can pass it. Let's debate it now. And then the third thing is actually simple. It needs to pass a regulatory framework that will define with more precision the question of compensation, because that is what is really getting a lot of debate.
And as I close this conversation, the Expropriation Act, that discussion is now done.
Yeah.
We park it on the side. We saw you last year at the International Court of Justice, representing South Africa as a state against the state of Israel, where you argued genocide that was being implemented on the people of Palestine. We now have a ceasefire. Give us your general sense as a lawyer representing the state in Netherlands, and more importantly, perhaps, now that we have a ceasefire, do you hope that it will hold? What's your overall perspective on what has happened?
in the Middle East?
But I mean, for the children of Gaza, we have to hope that it holds. There has been too much killing of innocent people. There's been too much destruction of property. So we have to hope that the ceasefire, firstly, is permanent, and that the children of Gaza can be allowed to return, to reconstitute their lives, and to live normally like we all do. We as black people have been there, and maybe not of the same scale, but we have been the victims of apartheid, victims of marginalization. And so we empathize with what is going on against the Palestinians. It has to end. One can't continue like this. So we hope that this ceasefire will be permanent, and it will in fact translate into an improvement in the human rights situation in Palestine.
Advocate Temira Mpayitobi, thank you very much for even allowing us to sway you to that side, because you can't talk about the merits of the case, but it is your perspective as someone who represented the state of South Africa against MzansiOz. Thank you very much for your time. Advocate Temira Mpayitobi, a lawyer and indeed a person who has written a book on land matters. All right, Khotso is here with your sports statements.
So, as you have listened to the expert about this law itself, like it's got a lot of problems. Not everyone is happy about this law, and for good reason. One of the main issues about this law that it doesn't go to 1652. The Australian reporter who was Sky News was talking about that many of these farmers date back to 400 years ago, which means that she claims that the Expropriation Act will go to 1652. It's false. That is 100% false, because that would be against the South African Constitution, because the Expropriation Act is in Section 25, and it dates back to 1913, where the apartheid dispossession law took place during that time, leading up to the apartheid being constitutionalized. So it doesn't go back to 1652, which is one of the main arguments of repealing the section, amending or repealing Section 25, so that it can include the Khoisan people and the Xhosas, who are the indigenous South African. Okay, South African, there was never a Bantu migration, as I said before, with something that was uttered by Malema that was false. It is still a narrative, white supremacy narrative of Bantu migration never existed. There are indigenous South Africans that need to have their land back. You know, we can see that in Cape Town, the consequences of that. So it is, as you can see, part B will be giving you some clips of different politicians, left and right politicians, center right and far right, national group. You can hear them everywhere talking about this issue. That really, it's about South African restitution and giving back the land to the people who could use that land. You can't just have a land that's fertile, edible, and be living somewhere in the UK or Australia or whatever Western society and have that land sitting there for speculation, where you have, when that land was acquired very violently from the rightful owners of those land. So it's only fair and equitable to be expropriated for public interest use, to move certain families who are living in low-lying areas. As we speak, the Alexander community should never have existed, should have been moved many years ago. is Alexander next to the very rich Santon. That Bantustan township should not exist. People should be moved to a land that's equitable, that is safe for them, that is not low-lying, going to put them in risk for flooding. So that is equity. What is just, what is market value. If you did not pay cent, you got it through by force, by taking away from someone else. It's only fair that you're getting paid for market value and taking into account how much you paid for. So this is part A of this Expropriation Act of South Africa. We're going to go to part B, which will talk lengthily about the issues from different politicians in South Africa talking about the issue. This Expropriation Act, it is not, doesn't make ANC, gain voters because it is, there's so many issues about it. Fell short of addressing restitution in South Africa. Thank you guys for listening. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. Until next time, see ya.